The night was dark, and the air was thick with the scent of impending doom. In a small, dimly lit room in Madrid, a young woman named Lucrecia de León trembled as she was dragged before the Inquisition. She was only 22, but her dreams had made her a figure of both awe and fear. Her visions of a Spain ravaged by war and invasion had become more vivid and terrifying, especially after the disastrous defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. The Inquisition, the ultimate arbiter of religious purity, had taken notice. Lucrecia's dreams were not just fantastical nightmares, they were seen as prophetic warnings. In one dream, she saw the mighty Spanish fleet destroyed by the English, months before it actually happened. In another, she foresaw Spain in ruins, with King Philip II, the once mighty ruler, blind to the dangers that loomed. Her words, whispered among the aristocrats at court, had spread like wildfire, and now she stood accused of heresy and spreading calumnies against the king. But Lucrecia was not alone. Women across Spain, whether noble or common, played a crucial role in the religious and cultural life of their communities. They were the ones who passed down family traditions, taught their children the language and beliefs of their ancestors, and often became the guardians of their community's spiritual heritage. This role made them both powerful and vulnerable, especially during times of religious and political turmoil. In the early 16th century, Spain was a land of intense religious fervor and deep-seated fears. Messianic movements and spiritual revivals were sweeping through Europe, and in Castile, women were often at the forefront of these movements. Some, like Teresa of Avila, became saints and wrote extensively about their spiritual journey. Others, like the Beatas women who lived pious lives outside of formal religious institutions, gained local fame and sometimes notoriety. The Church and the Inquisition watched these women closely. While the Inquisition was not specifically misogynistic, it did not hesitate to investigate and, if necessary, discipline those who stepped outside the accepted bounds of religious behavior. Bishops and local authorities often tried to bring these women under their control, but the Inquisition had a broader mandate. They were tasked with maintaining the purity of the faith and preventing the spread of heresy, which meant they had to be vigilant. In the small villages and towns of Spain, where everyone knew everyone else's business, it was easy for rumors to spread. If a woman claimed to have visions or perform miracles, the community might venerate her as a saint, or they might accuse her of witchcraft. The Inquisition stepped in when these local conflicts escalated, acting as mediators and judges. They relied heavily on denunciations from the public, and in the tight-knit communities of rural Spain, it was not uncommon for women to be among those brought before the Holy Office. However, the Inquisition was not always the harsh, unforgiving force it is often portrayed as. Many women, like Lucrecia, were eventually released without severe punishment. Some, like the young Paula Ponsa, who had affairs with several priests in her parish, were blamed by the community rather than the clergy. The inquisitors, recognizing the social dynamics at play, often showed leniency, understanding that the women's actions were often driven by a mix of ignorance and cultural norms. The Inquisition's reach extended beyond religious matters into the realm of sexual morality. In a time when the boundaries between sin and social norms were often blurred, the Inquisition sought to enforce the strict moral codes laid out by the Church. This included cracking down on practices like concubinage, which was seen as a lesser sin by many, and the widespread belief that simple fornication between unmarried adults was not a sin. The inquisitors, especially in urban areas, tried to impose a more rigorous moral framework, but they often met with resistance from rural communities where traditional practices prevailed. In the end, the Inquisition's role in the lives of women like Lucrecia and Paula was complex and multifaceted. They were both protectors and persecutors, mediators and judges. The women of Spain, whether visionary or visionary, played a crucial role in shaping the religious and cultural landscape of their time, and their stories continue to resonate through the centuries. In pre-industrial Spain, marriage was a serious commitment, but life was unpredictable. Men and women often left their homes to find work or went to fight in wars, sometimes disappearing for many years. When someone's spouse was absent for a long time, it was common for the other person to assume the missing spouse was dead. This led to situations where people would remarry, sometimes without knowing if their first marriage was still valid. The Inquisition, a powerful religious court, dealt with these cases. For men, the punishment was usually a public whipping and a few years of hard labor in the galleys. Women, on the other hand, were often banished from their communities. One interesting case is that of Francisco Casio, who was arrested in 1694. He believed his second marriage was valid and wrote to his parish priest for advice. He thought that his first marriage needed to be revalidated to continue, but this revalidation was actually with another woman in a different place. The Inquisition also played a role in addressing the behavior of clergy, who were supposed to follow strict rules, including celibacy. However, many priests and bishops ignored these rules and had relationships with women, sometimes even keeping them as housekeepers. This was a widespread issue, and the Inquisition, along with church courts, tried to enforce the rules. For example, in 1561-62, the Vicar General of Barcelona had to warn 57 clergy members about their relationships with women. Another area where the Inquisition was involved was in dealing with sodomy, which was considered a grave sin. The Inquisition's approach to this crime was complex. In some regions, like Aragon, the Inquisition had the authority to handle these cases, while in others, like Castile, they did not. The punishment for sodomy was harsh, often involving burning at the stake, but the Inquisition sometimes showed mercy, especially to minors or clergy. For example, Pedro Galceran de Borja, a high-ranking nobleman, was fined but allowed to return to his political life after his trial. The Inquisition also dealt with cases of witchcraft and sorcery, which were widespread in Europe. In Spain, women were more often accused of witchcraft, but men were also targeted. The Inquisition's involvement in these cases was driven by complaints from local communities. The Inquisition did not actively seek out witches, but responded to the concerns of the people. Some scholars argue that the persecution of witches was not primarily about misogyny, but about the social and economic tensions within communities. For example, in Catalonia, a Jesuit named Pierre Gil noted that the accused were often poor, uneducated, and vulnerable women. The Inquisition's approach to witchcraft was cautious. Initially, they followed the secular courts in punishing witches by burning them. However, over time, they became more skeptical about the existence of the Sabbat, witches' gatherings, and the idea that witches could fly or consort with the devil. This skepticism was shared by some clergy, who believed that these stories were delusions rather than actual crimes. Overall, the Inquisition's role in these matters was to enforce the moral and religious standards of the time, but their impact on changing people's behavior was limited. Despite the harsh punishments, many people continued to engage in non-marital relationships, and the Inquisition's involvement often reflected the community's own standards rather than imposing new ones. In the early 1500s, Spain was grappling with a growing belief in witchcraft and superstition, especially in the rural areas. Two friars, Martin de Castanga and Pedro de Cerullo, published books in 1529 warning against these beliefs. They argued that the rural population's ignorance was to blame, and that education, not punishment, was the solution. However, some secular courts, like those in Navarre, took a harsher approach. In 1525, the state prosecutor Balanza ordered the execution of about 30 alleged witches in Navarre. The Holy Office, or the Inquisition, usually stayed out of witchcraft cases. They didn't believe the devil had the power to do such things, and didn't have exclusive jurisdiction over witchcraft. This changed in 1526, when Inquisitor General Manrique called a meeting in Granada to discuss the issue. A committee of 10, including lawyers and future inquisitors, debated whether witches really attended the Sabbat, a meeting with the devil. 6 members believed they did, while 4, including Hernando de Guevara and the future Inquisitor General Valdes, thought it was all in their imagination. The committee decided that if witches confessed to crimes like murder, they should be tried by the Inquisition, not the civil authorities. However, if the civil authorities had proof of a crime, they could act on their own. The committee also suggested educating the people about the errors of witchcraft and reforming monasteries in the region. They emphasized the need to preach in Basque, the local language, to reach the people effectively. Despite these decisions, witch trials continued, but the Inquisition played a smaller role. For example, in Navarre, inquisitors were told to consult the Suprema, the highest council of the Inquisition, and local judges before proceeding with any cases. In 1538, when more troubles arose in Navarre, the Inquisitor Valdeolivas was instructed to reassure the people that bad weather and other ills were not caused by witches. In other parts of Spain, the Inquisition remained skeptical. The tribunal in Saragossa executed a witch in 1535, but was reprimanded by the Suprema and never executed another witch again. In 1550, the Inquisitor of Barcelona, Diego Sarmiento, was dismissed for executing witches without referring the cases to the Suprema. The case began when a man named Juan Mallet was hired to identify witches in the Tarragona area. People were arrested based on his accusations, and Sarmiento took custody of some of the women, leading to their execution. The Suprema was horrified and sent Francisco Vega to investigate. Vega found no credible evidence of witchcraft and recommended freeing the detainees and returning their confiscated goods. Sarmiento was dismissed, and the Inquisition in Catalonia stopped persecuting witches. The Inquisition maintained this stance throughout the 1500s. In 1568, the Suprema ordered the Barcelona tribunal to hand over a case of incantations to the episcopal court. In Navarre in 1596, the Inquisitor decided not to handle a witchcraft case and let the civil authorities handle it. In 1591, Juana Izquierdo was tried before the Toledo tribunal for allegedly murdering children. Despite 16 witnesses confirming the deaths and her reputation as a witch, she received a lenient sentence: abjuration de levi, a minor form of penance, and 200 lashes. However, there was a setback in 1609 to 1610. In the Pays de Labourd, just across the border in France, Judge Pierre de Lancer executed 80 witches, causing fear in nearby Navarre. This led to a witch scare in Spanish territory, and the inquisitors in Logrono, including Alonso de Salazar Frias, held a large auto de fe, a public ceremony where sentences were handed down in November 1610. 29 people were accused of witchcraft, and 6 were burned alive. The Suprema reacted strongly and sent Salazar to Navarre in 1611 to assess the situation. After examining the confessions and evidence, Salazar concluded that there was no proof of any real acts of witchcraft. He believed that most of the accusations were false, and that discussing witchcraft only made the problem worse. He recommended silence and reserve to calm the public's fears. Salazar's report was supported by other inquisitors and scholars, like Pedro de Valencia, who advised careful examination of the accused to ensure they were of sound mind before proceeding. On August 29, 1614, the Suprema issued new instructions that reaffirmed the policy of skepticism and leniency in witchcraft cases. These instructions were followed for the rest of the Inquisition's history. Even with this approach, witches weren't completely safe. Civil authorities continued to prosecute and execute witches, especially in Aragon and Catalonia. In Aragon, witches were hanged, and in Catalonia, dozens were executed in the early 1600s. However, the Inquisition's more lenient stance meant that Spain avoided the widespread witch hunts and burnings that occurred in other parts of Europe. In the old days, the blame for the unfair trials and harsh punishments of witches often fell on judges. Historians thought these judges were mean and forced their beliefs on simple people who didn't know any better. But as more and more cases came to light, scholars started to think differently. They realized that the real push for witch trials often came from the villagers themselves, not the judges. In small towns, accusations of witchcraft were often just about family problems or arguments between neighbors. In Spain, the Inquisition, which was a powerful church court, understood this. They saw how people in the community could turn on each other, especially against women. For example, in 1679, a woman named Pascuala Gil, who was married to a shepherd, was accused of being a witch by her neighbors. But when she appeared before the Inquisition in Saragossa, the judges found her to be honest and innocent. Another woman, Maria Perez, was also accused, but the Inquisition decided that all 21 of her accusers, even the priest, were just being mean, and they declared her innocent too. Now, when people today talk about witch trials, they sometimes say that the Spanish Inquisition was as bad as other courts in Europe, but that's not true. In Spain, there were no big witch hunts or mass executions. The judges were not bloodthirsty, and people didn't suddenly stop believing in witches because they became smarter. One important person, Francisco Vega, actually helped end witch trials, but he did it by carefully following the rules of evidence, not because he was a modern thinker. When you look at what happened in other parts of Europe, like in Germany and England, from 1560 to 1630, there were lots of witch trials and many people died. But in Spain, life was much calmer. The Inquisition, and even the regular courts, didn't focus much on witches. This shows that Spain's approach was quite different from the rest of Europe. Now, let's talk about something else that was important in Spain: the idea of honor and purity of blood. In the old days, people in Spain, like in many other places, cared a lot about honor. Honor was about how others saw you, and how you behaved. For nobles, it was about being brave, pious, and wealthy. If you did something bad, like commit a crime or act dishonorably, people would look down on you. But if you were a noble, you had ways to protect your honor, even if it meant fighting or challenging someone to a duel. Over time, the idea of honor became linked to blood purity. People started to think that being a true Christian meant having no Jewish or Muslim ancestors. This idea became more important in the 1400s and 1500s. For example, in the famous book Don Quixote, the character Sancho Panza says, "Though poor, I am an old Christian and owe nothing to anybody." He was proud that he had no Jewish blood. In the 1400s, some cities in Spain started to make rules to keep people with Jewish or Muslim ancestors out of important jobs. In 1436, Barcelona said that people who were once Jewish couldn't be notaries. In 1446, the city of Villena in Castile got a special rule to keep these people from living there. But these rules weren't the same everywhere. In some places, like Lleida, people with Jewish backgrounds fought to keep their jobs. The idea of blood purity became more serious in the 1440s and 1460s, during times of political trouble. In Castile, a powerful leader named Álvaro de Luna, who was of Jewish descent, had enemies who accused him and his supporters of causing problems. In 1449, the city of Toledo made a rule that people with Jewish ancestry couldn't hold office. This caused a big debate, and some important people, like the Bishop of Burgos, Alonso de Cartagena, wrote that Jews were part of the Christian tradition and should be treated fairly. The Inquisition, which started in the 1480s, did make things harder for people with Jewish ancestry. They were often accused of practicing Judaism in secret, and many were punished. This made people think that to protect true Christianity, these people should be kept out of important roles. In 1483, a rule was made that inquisitors had to be old Christians, meaning they couldn't have Jewish or Muslim ancestors. Some religious groups and universities started to make rules to exclude people with these backgrounds. However, these rules were not common in all of Spain. They were mostly found in central and southern Castile. Many places, especially in the north, didn't care about blood purity as much. Even when the Inquisition was active, most institutions didn't make rules about blood purity. It wasn't until the 1500s that more places started to adopt these rules. So, while the idea of blood purity became more important over time, it wasn't something that everyone in Spain agreed on. The Inquisition played a role in making it more common, but it wasn't the only reason it happened. The story of Spain's struggle with the concept of limpieza de sangre, or blood purity, is a complex and often misunderstood chapter in history. It began with the Inquisition's harsh punishments for those accused of heresy, which cast a shadow over their families for generations. Children and grandchildren of those condemned were barred from holding public offices, becoming clergy, or even working as physicians or merchants. This exclusion was not based on race, but on the suspicion of heresy, though the lines often blurred in practice. Despite these rules, the reality was far from black and white. Many institutions, including the Spanish College in Bologna, continued to admit and even promote individuals of Jewish descent. The Geronimite order, for example, faced internal conflicts over whether to accept conversos Jews who had converted to Christianity. When a scandal erupted in 1485 involving a friar accused of practicing Judaism, the order eventually adopted a statute excluding conversos, but this was a rare and controversial move. Other religious orders, like the Franciscans and Dominicans, resisted similar measures, often reversing them under pressure from higher authorities. The most significant test of the limpieza concept came in 1547, when Archbishop Juan Martinez Silicio of Toledo pushed through a statute to exclude conversos from the cathedral chapter. Silicio, a man of humble origins, was deeply concerned about the perceived threat of conversos to the church. His statute, however, faced immediate and strong opposition. The city council of Toledo, the nobility, and even the prince himself saw it as a dangerous and divisive measure. The statute was suspended, and it took nearly a decade before it was finally confirmed, though it was often ignored in practice. The idea of blood purity, while influential, was never as widespread or as uniformly accepted as some historians have suggested. Many Spaniards, including members of the nobility and the royal court, opposed the exclusion of conversos. The concept of limpieza was limited to a few regions and institutions, and it did not define Spanish society as a whole. In fact, everyday interactions often transcended these rules, as people from different backgrounds lived, worked, and married together without much regard for their ancestors. When the Spanish colonized the Americas, they brought with them a mix of ideas, including some notions of racial purity. However, these ideas were not unique to Spain. Other European colonizers, such as the British and the French, also held prejudices about race and blood. The colonial context, with its own unique social and economic dynamics, shaped the development of racial hierarchies in the New World. In the end, the story of Limpieza de Sangre in Spain is a tale of tension between official policies and the lived experiences of people. It shows how deeply rooted social and cultural practices can resist even the most rigid and discriminatory laws. The legacy of this period is a reminder of the complexity of human societies and the ongoing struggle for equality and justice.